Okay, thanks very much, Frank. Yeah, so as Frank says, I work in a kind of a number of areas, probably half my time in combinatorial optimization, but the other half at the moment in evolutionary robotics. So I thought I'd talk to you today about that. Okay, so you're probably aware that robots are kind of ubiquitous now in the world. You see them in factories in places like Amazon, collecting things off shelves. People even have them in their homes. And often in hospitals where they're even able to do some kind of operations. But if you look at these kind of robots, they're obviously designed by human engineers, and they're designed to accomplish a task that is really well known to the engineer that's designing them, who can envisage what the robot should look like because they know what the robot needs to do, and they can envisage the kind of scenarios that the robot might find itself into. And so they're able to kind of design the control system of the robot to cope with these things that they can foresee that the robot might have to do. So that's fine, but what if you want to design a robot to work in a different situation? For example, cleaning up a nuclear reactor where you can't send a human inside, so you don't know what it's going to look like, so you don't know what your robot should look like. What if you wanted to send it to a planet or an asteroid to do some exploration? So again, you don't know what kind of surfaces you might come across. You don't know what kind of tools the robot might need. Same if you want to send it to the bottom of the sea. So these kind of situations make it much more difficult for the designer because you don't really know what shape the robot should be, neither what kind of control capabilities. And this could be frustrating and very expensive. So for example, if I could just get my computer to work, oops, sorry. If you imagine you designed a robot and you send it off to some planet, it's supposed to do some kind of collecting of material or exploration, and you find that actually when it gets there after 10 years of space travel, it doesn't have the right tools, it doesn't have the right means of locomotion, so it can't do the task it's designed for. So kind of motivated by these big questions of how do you do design in unknown environments, we started to wonder, could you have a mechanism where some software and some kind of manufacturing equipment could actually design robots in situ in the place in which they actually need to do their work? So rather than pre-design and send them off to do this job, could they actually design themselves there in the environment they're supposed to work in? So this is the big kind of question that motivates our work. So, you know, I come from an evolutionary computation background. So it's natural to kind of look around us and think, well, nature's pretty good at design and evolving things that are very well suited for the environment they find themselves in. So can we start to copy this? There's some really nice examples in the natural world. So, for example, this is a vine you find in rainforests. It's evolved these leaves that are shaped exactly like satellite dishes. And what they do is amplify the signals that bats send out, and it attracts the bats to the flowers and it increases the pollination of the flowers. So it's a really nice example of design. I really like this video because it shows really nice controls. So this is obviously it's a dog. But nature come up with a really good control mechanism that's able to allow this dog to kind of deal with an unknown environment to some extent and manage to control its limbs and able to accomplish this task. So inspired by this, we kind of want to build some evolutionary system that can perhaps do the same thing in terms of robotics. And actually, it's not so far-fetched. So if you know your artificial evolutionary history, actually the very first application of an evolutionary strategy in this case was actually to a design application to this nail plate back in 1964. And that even made the newspapers back in Germany back in 1964. And you're probably also aware of this really nice example that came from the same group. It's another design application to design this gas flow pipe. And what's really interesting about this, I think, is that the design that the evolutionary algorithm comes up with is in some way creative, if I can use that word. It's not like anything that a human engineer might have designed. So this is another reason why evolution might be a good thing for designing objects, because as well as trying to find things that are optimal for their use, it might be unconstrained by the kind of views that we have as human designers and engineers and be able to come up with some things that we might not have thought of. So of course, back in 1964, it was quite difficult to do evolution, given the kind of computation that they had around. We've got much better tools at our disposal now. And this has really increased our ability to do this kind of design work with evolutionary computation. It's partly helped by improved simulation tools that let you simulate really good physics that's quite close to reality. It's obviously massively improved by the amount of CPU or GPU power we have at our disposal. It's really been helped by some advances in the theory of evolutionary computation, in some new encodings that allow you to come up with more imaginative things. And I'll talk about some of these later on. From an engineering perspective, it's also helped by some new materials. So rather than just having to design with, I don't know if you're building robots, things like steel or plastic, you can design with soft materials that you can pass current through so they can change their properties kind of on the fly. And this really opens up the design space for a designer. And finally, this is really engineering, but it also helps if you're trying to do evolutionary computation in this space. With the advent of cheap 3D printing and the ability to autonomously put together a robot, for example, using a kind of arm that you would see in a factory, you can really rapidly prototype anything that your evolutionary algorithm might come up with. So collectively, all of these things kind of really empower us to be able to use evolutionary computation in this space. And just to give you some examples before I go on to talk about robots of where evolution has really worked. So you're probably also aware of this application from back in 2006, where NASA used an evolutionary algorithm to design this communications antenna. This actually went into space on a satellite. And again, here you can probably see that the design that the algorithm has come up with is kind of quite odd looking. It's probably not something like a human might design. I came across this quite recently. It was in some of the news outlets. It's also another system from NASA where they use, again, this process they call generative design, but it's essentially an evolutionary system. Where it's being used to design these kind of backpacks for spacesuits to try and really optimize the design to make them as lightweight and long-lasting as possible. And so they're again using an evolutionary approach to do this. And this is supposedly going to be used in the upcoming moon landings that they're planning for 2023. Just some more examples just to show that this is really getting into quite a lot of different kinds of applications. So actually you see quite a lot of examples of this evolutionary design in the building and architecture space now, either designing floor layouts or buildings themselves. And there's also quite a use for it in the automotive car manufacture space. So here was a recent paper is to do the design of a wing mirror, but there's been quite a lot of applications, particularly by a company called Autodesk that are based in London, that have been designing parts for motorbikes and part of the engines in cars, really with a desire to make things as kind of lightweight but as strong as possible, or in this case with the car wing mirror as efficient as possible. So evolution is being used a lot in this design space now. But when we think about robots, it kind of shifts the question a little bit, because all of the things I've shown you just now are static objects that you just design them and that they don't have to move or do anything. They don't have agency to do anything by themselves. But if you want to start designing robots, life is much more complicated, because firstly, robots have sensors so they can see the world. They might have cameras, things that allow them to see the ground or pick up heat or infrared, something like that. They've got, and this sensory information is fed into a computer, as it's essentially a brain, and that brain has got to decide what to do with that information and then activate whatever means of getting around that the robot has. So in this case, it's a robot with legs. It might be a robot with wheels. So it makes things much more complicated, because now you have to design body and brain, and you can't really design the two things separately because they're obviously really tightly coupled. So you could design a body and then try and find the best brain for it afterwards, but actually you're kind of missing the benefits of evolution there, because you might have designed the wrong body in the first place. So you need to basically do the design simultaneously of both things in order that evolution can come up with the best combination of the two. Otherwise, if you do it either way around, you're just making a compromise. Okay, so okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about our work in this space, but what I thought I would do first is just kind of set a little bit of context by talking about the history of this in the evolutionary computation field. So it's not a new idea to do this. It was first thought of around 20-something years ago. So this was work by Hod Lipson's team in the States, where they wanted to evolve these robots, so body and brain simultaneously. And what you can see on the top there is so what they do is they evolve in simulation, and then when the simulation's finished, they take the best robot and they build it by hand. And you can see here that the physical built little robot works pretty much in the same way as the simulation. So this was quite nice in the time. It's this co-evolution of body and control. But the robot is quite simple, so it has a way of moving, but it doesn't have any way of sensing its environment, so it can't react to anything that it sees in its environment. Okay, so the same team went on to do some more work about 10 years later. So this is with these soft materials that I was talking about. So this is in fact two types of soft material, and each material has a different property, and it basically expands and contracts at different rates. So if I can just like that. Okay, so here again, co-evolution of body and control. So here, each little cube is essentially expanding and contracting at a determined rate. And the goal of the evolutionary process is to find something that can move as far as possible. So it's designed again in simulation. At the time when they built this, they couldn't use the materials properly, so they put them in a pressure chamber, and it's actually the pressure that's externally changing that kind of gives this contraction expansion behavior. But you can see again, evolution has come up with something that does what it's asked. It gives a shape that is able to move, and the body and control are designed simultaneously. But again, the robot can't sense anything about its environment. Okay, so I just wanted to show you one more example, and you might have seen this recently in the news. So this is work from Josh Bongard's group in the States. So again, they are designing body and controller in software, and the things they're designing look much like the thing that you just saw. But the really remarkable thing I think here is after they've designed them in evolution, they actually build the best design using living stem cells from frogs. So it's basically like, it really is the world's first living robot. So I just wanted to show you this because it doesn't have sensors, but it's really incredible that you can do this now. So basically they use the evolution to do the pre-design. You'll see a picture in a second. So it's just asked to move as far as possible. Again, it's built out of these two materials that can then move at different rates. Evolution comes up with various different configurations. And then what you'll see when the video changes is the actual thing that was made of the stem cells. Okay. So obviously this is somewhat magnified, but you'll see it moving in a second. So they then built this obviously under a microscope. And here's the little moving robot that moves much in the same way. And actually they went on to show, if I just speed the video up, it can do various things. So you can basically get them to have different shapes. And if they've got these kind of sort of like holes in them, they're able to, well, for example, kind of scoop up material or kind of surround something so they can move it from one place to another. You'll see that in the next. So here you can see that they're able to push things. So they can do some kind of manipulation, and they could also do sort of object transport by basically capturing it inside the cells. So this is like really, I'll stop that there. Really cool work, but again, no sensors. And so the things can move, but they can't react. So we really wanted to be able to build complete robots that are able to sense their environment, be very well suited to their environment, and then react to it. Okay. And one of the things that you really always see when you try and do this kind of robotics is when you build something after you've involved in simulation, it never works the same in reality as it did in simulation. So it's called the reality gap. So actually around 5 years ago, some people in Cambridge trying to solve this by saying, okay, let's get rid of the simulation with the evolutionary algorithm altogether, and let's just do everything completely in hardware. So they have these little cubes that the robot's made out of, plus the smaller cubes are motors. So everything is done directly in hardware here now. So the algorithm runs inside a computer. The genome basically describes what modules the robot should be built out of, how they should be connected together, and where the motors should be attached. Again, it doesn't have sensors, but then if I just move on. So then they have this automated arm that is sent basically the genome and then constructs the robot directly. So they have these blocks. I don't know if you can see it very clearly on the video. They're basically glued together. So it squirts out this glue, it glues the pieces together. So it builds each robot in the population on the fly, attaches to motors. And then it does a fitness evaluation in hardware. It basically, you'll see it in a minute, it puts it in an arena, watches it with a camera, and then determines the fitness by how far it moves. And then this drives the evolutionary algorithm. So you'll see here, it's now manufactured it, sticks it in the arena, and then it does a fitness evaluation by just seeing how quickly it moves and whether it falls off the table or not. So this is definitely progress. It's trying to fix this reality gap by doing everything in hardware. But again, the robots are pretty simple. They don't have any sensors. And just finally, before I get onto our work, this is some work from Gus Iben's group in the Netherlands. So they want to do exactly the same thing. They're working now exactly in hardware, in hardware as well, although rather than automating the assembly, they're doing it by hand. So this is more trying to mimic what you actually see in the biological world, is where you have an actual population existing all at the same. So in the previous one, each robot was built one at a time, evaluated, and then put away. Here you have multiple robots. The robots move around. If they come in close proximity to each other, they swap their genomes. So if you're near another robot, you send your robot your genome. The robot collects some genomes from other robots it's met, and then it does some kind of selection, crossover, mutation, and comes up with a design for a new robot that's then built. So this is trying to mimic much more the type of evolution you see in the real world. Okay, so this brings me on to this project that I'm currently involved in that was funded by the UK government to try and really push this forward by trying to evolve robots that can have like really rich designs in a morphological space, are capable of sensing, are capable of moving. And everything in theory could be automated, so that in theory you could box this up and send it off to a planet or some faraway glacier or rainforest, and the system could design and manufacture robots in a kind of never-ending loop. So the idea is that there'd be some sort of fabricator that runs the evolutionary algorithm that designs the robot. Once you've designed the robot would first go in some kind of training facility. So this is a little bit like, you know, when babies are born, you have to refine your motor control. So you basically have some period in your first few years where you're basically learning to handle things and coordinate eye-hand movement. So this is really necessary with these robots, because especially when you're continuously changing the bodies, the controllers they inherit are not likely to work very well. So they have this training period where they basically refine their motor control, and they're put out and then into a kind of real life arena. And this is where they get their fitness evaluations. And the idea is that basically you can run this in a loop, things can be recycled, and you can continue to make new robots out of the parts of the old one. So this is the kind of motivating vision. Obviously, there's a lot of science and engineering that needs to be done to realize that. So I just wanted to talk about why it's difficult and some of the things that we've done along the way. So we're really trying to target this design in an unknown environment by basically having the system design in the environment, try and do as much as we can in hardware to avoid the reality gap, and really try and use a space of things to build the robots that kind of goes beyond the sort of simple modular things that I just showed you in the previous slide. Okay, so there's a lot of challenges in here, scientific and engineering. So the first is to do with how you represent this kind of joint body brain space. And the second, which I'll talk about later, is that you need to really, this is the kind of goes back to this kind of kindergarten thing I showed in the slide. You really need to combine evolution with some kind of learning to allow an evolved robot to rapidly adapt its control to its new space. And then also, and this is the work that's done by my collaborator in Bristol, there's a lot of engineering challenges in how you actually build these robots without a human in the loop, which I'll just touch on at the end. Okay, so this is basically the framework we use. So I said we wanted to do everything in physical because that allows you to avoid this reality gap. But actually, it doesn't make sense to waste all the computational power that you have. So we built this framework that has basically mirrored systems. It has a virtual system running an evolutionary algorithm, and then there's a separate evolutionary algorithm running directly in the physical system. And the idea is you can run different evolutionary algorithms in each space. So in the virtual system, we have a very large population. We do a lot of have a very sort of explorative EA that can really kind of explore a really wide range of different designs to come up with some good ones. It sends the best ones or the ones that look most useful to the physical system. And so we have a much smaller population running on the physical side. The algorithm is much more exploitative, and it's all bootstrapped from things that came from the virtual simulation. So if you've got this, you can basically, as the EA on the virtual side is running all the time, you can keep sending things from the virtual to the physical side. You can also send things the genetic material of things that have evolved on the physical side back to the virtual side. Why would you want to do that? It's because the things on the physical side are working in reality, so you know they work well in reality. So by sending them back to the virtual side and allowing them to be part of the evolutionary loop on the virtual side, you're hoping to kind of pass to the virtual side what it is that makes something work in reality. And also we can do this kind of hybridized reproduction. So you can take, rather than having the parents all selected from one side or another, you can select a parent from the virtual side and a parent from the physical side when they're both running simultaneously, and you can do crossover and mutation on this hybridized thing that comes half from the physical and half from the virtual, and hopefully you get the best of both worlds. So the idea is this framework is basically continuously running, and you're always sending things between the two so that you can basically refine the population on the physical side. So this is the framework. Let me go into some of the details about it. So I said we wanted to work in a much more complex space so you can build more complicated robots. So our evolutionary algorithm has access to a kind of library of components. So it has a head, it basically has a Raspberry Pi in it, and this is going to be the brain of the robot that kind of manages the controller. But it has a whole range of components that can be used to build a robot. So it has joints, so you can build legs with multiple joints in them. It has wheels, it has multiple different types of sensors, so you can sense different things about the environment. It has a camera. It also has a caster wheel, which can't be directly controlled, but can help stabilize the robot itself. So in terms of the kind of components, we have all of these different things that the robot can be built out of. But the bigger difference is that the body of the robot, the kind of skeleton of it, as I call it, is completely free form. So the algorithm isn't fixed to kind of just like building something out of modular blocks. It can really come up with any kind of skeleton it wants. And this shape is completely defined by the evolutionary process. And then it can just be 3D printed. And it's 3D printed in a way that it has these kind of connecting parts, you just see at the bottom right there, which allow these things to be slotted onto the skeleton after it's been built. And the skeleton also always leaves this kind of big hole where the head with the Raspberry Pi goes in. So this is really changing the landscape in which we're trying to evolve. It obviously makes things much more complicated because you have these freeform skeletons and you can attach these things anywhere on that skeleton. So this is just some of the things that have come out of this. I'll show you them working shortly, but this is really just to illustrate. We get what we call various different kinds of species. So here's a robot that only has essentially legs. These are jointed things that can move at any of the jointed positions. Here's a robot that with a completely different shape that mainly has wheels. The one on the bottom has wheels and legs. This one's quite interesting because it's basically evolved this kind of tower on the skeleton with sensors attached to the top. And what this does is it allows it to like see over the top of walls. So if you're, for example, navigating a maze, then this is a really good design because you can basically see where you're going because you're not just seeing at the sort of level of ground level of the robot. So this is really just to show that you can get all kind of different things emerging from this algorithm that I'm going to describe in a minute. Okay, but this also makes evolution really difficult, particularly when you start getting these things like where you've got legs and wheels on the same thing. So just to put this back to, so in biological evolution, there is some examples where you kind of get interspecies breeding. So there's some evidence in the DNA records, if you look at the big cat population, where there has been mixing between different species of big cat in the past, although generally this kind of hybridization tends to be a sort of evolutionary dead end. But what you never see in biological evolution is like completely breeding between two species of completely different types. So this is just some cartoon I found on the internet, but like an owl and a leopard mixing together. So you don't ever see this in biological evolution. So the evolutionary process doesn't have to cope with, well, how do I build a brain for this strange thing that's just evolved? But that's exactly what we want to do here. We want to be able to take a legged robot, breed it with a wheeled robot, and come up with something that is somewhere in the middle, because that might be the right thing for the environment. And this, so although it's kind of easy to do this kind of breeding in the morphological space, it's much harder to do it in the brain space, because if you take the brain that controls the leg robot and the brain that controls the wheeled robot and you do crossover between those two things, you're unlikely to get anything that actually works very well. Okay, so I'm going to now just quickly tell you how we solve some of these problems. So first of all, in terms of the encodings, we're using indirect encodings because this basically allows you to do much more things. So what's really encoded on the genome is two things. One is a set of instructions that allows you to generate a body. It tells you what shape the skeleton should be, which sensors and actuators you should use, where they should go. And a separate set of instructions which is paired with the body, which generates a controller to control that body. And you can basically do standard evolution on these sets of instructions, crossover mutation. I'll explain. Okay, so we're using compositional pattern producing networks, CPPNs, PPNs. I don't know how familiar these are to people. It's a type of neural network that basically you can feed in some inputs and it gives you some outputs, but it has a mix. The difference between a standard neural network, it has a whole range of different functions in the middle layers. And these functions are specifically chosen so they can produce kind of patterns. So you can have periodic functions that produce kind of segmented patterns. You can have Gaussian functions that produce more symmetrical things. Linear type functions tend to produce fractal-like patterns. And this is actually quite helpful in the case of like design, because like most things you see in real evolution are kind of symmetrical in some way. So being able to produce these patterns is really helpful. So what we're actually doing, so what's actually being encoded on the genome is this neural network, and this is what's evolving. And this neural network outputs either the body of the robot or the controller of the robot. So I'll show you how that works, but this is just a kind of illustration to show that these networks, these CPPNs, are really capable of producing all kinds of really nice patterns, which are symmetrical or have imperfect symmetry, or have these kind of fractal-like repetitions. Okay, so how does it work? So we have two CPPNs, one for the body and one for the brain. So if you imagine a robot is built in a three-dimensional space that's made of kind of small cubes, what we do is let me show you it like this. So this is a top-down view on a cube of cubes. So what you do is you feed in the coordinates of each of the small cubes, and the network outputs what should you put at that coordinate. So what you see is just a top-down view here. So what you can see here, it's built a robot that has this shape if you look top-down. So this is by just passing each one of these small cubes into the network, and then it tells you what to put there. And then we do multiple passes through this. So we do one pass through, and it tells us how to build the skeleton. And then once we've got the skeleton, the purple bit in the middle, we do another pass through. So now we pass the coordinates of all of the cubes that are on the outside of the skeleton, because these are places where you can attach things. And this tells you what you should whether you should put anything at that place. So it might say, no, don't put anything there. The red one means put a wheel there. The green one means put a sensor there. So the second pass-through basically tells us where we should put things, and then we just have to kind of resolve that, tidy up a bit, and so you get what you see on the right, which is basically the top-down view that is the skeleton shape, and it tells you where you should attach each of these things. So we can do exactly the same. So the brain is built in exactly the same way. We have another CPPN, but here, what you're passing through is so you imagine that when you've got the new body that's just been built, you can overlay a neural network on top of that body. So now you know how many sensors and actuators it's got. You can basically overlay a neural network on top of this. And what this CPPN is doing is you pass in the coordinates of each of the neurons, and it outputs the weight that goes between each of those neurons. So, and the bias for each of these neurons. So this is, so you create a fixed structure neural network because you know what the structure, well, you know how many inputs and outputs there should be because of the body you've just evolved. And this neural network is telling you, this neural network is outputting the weights of the neural network that actually controls the robot. So both of these things are evolving in tandem together. So a pair of them defines a robot. Okay, so this is one of the things that comes out of this. Remember I said earlier that if you inherit a controller, it's quite unlikely to work very well in the new body. So this robot's supposed to get to the end of this kind of chamber. There's some walls, it can't get over them. It doesn't work very well because the new body, which has got some legs and some wheels, doesn't really match to either of its parents. Okay, so to deal with that, then what we do is add in a learning component. So the evolution gives us the body plus brain, but we're going to add this separate thing into the loop, which basically says, once we've got this body and brain, can we add a learning step? It's the blue block here, to try and improve the inherited controller. And actually, we've tried multiple things in here. We've tried to take the inherited controller and apply some learning algorithm so the inherited controller has the weights specified by the CPPN, but then you can run another learning algorithm on top of that and try and improve these inherited weights. We actually use an evolution strategy, but there's no reason why you can't use a Bayesian optimization process or reinforcement learning. It doesn't really matter what the learning algorithm is. You can also, we've also tried different things. We've also tried just throwing away the inherited controller and just learning from scratch, and then a more refined process that I'll talk about now. But this learning process is really important. If you don't do the learning, you have really, really slow evolution. So it's just like an extra thing that's bolted onto the evolutionary loop, and whatever comes out of the evolution undergoes this learning phase. Okay. So here's one now after it's had the learning with an evolution. This is the same robot I showed you earlier, and you can see now that actually after it's refined its controller, it's capable of pushing itself over these walls and getting itself to the target. So we did a little bit of work here where we compared evolution strategies and Bayesian optimization, and actually found that the evolution strategy was faster at doing this. Okay, so here's a more recent idea. So after seeing some work in the cultural evolutionary literature, we thought we might be able to take some inspiration from this. So in a standard evolutionary algorithm, you have a population, you create some offspring, the offspring inherit traits, attributes from the current population. So the information in the offspring is directly transmitted from parents. Okay. But in these cultural evolutionary algorithms, you'll add on an extra thing, which is they call a belief space. And what this belief space does is extract information from every population, every generation, and kind of store them in a library, you can call it, which is basically holding information about anything that's ever been seen. And then the idea, so in our case, we're going to store controller information about any controllers we've come across. And then the idea is that these offspring, rather than just inheriting from their parents, can also inherit from this belief space, because this contains information about past generations that might have learned something useful. So this could speed up the learning. So we implement like this. So we have the thing I just told you about, where you have a population, it makes a body and brain, you refine it with a learning algorithm. But what we do is is every time we've refined it to get a new controller, we store that controller in this grid. It looks a bit like the sort of map elites things you see from the QD literature. So this grid is defined by a descriptor that describes the kind of species of the robot. So it's actually multidimensional. I've just shown it in 2D here, but basically it describes the number of each type of sensor, the number of wheels, and the number of joints on the robot. So when we've got a new robot, we can kind of map it to a position in the grid, and we store in the grid the controller we found, the learned controller we found for that robot. And then if we come across another robot with the same descriptor later on, now there can be multiple robots with it. So for example, if you imagine a robot with 2 wheels, that robot can have lots of different shapes and the wheels can be in lots of different places. So you can have many robots, all that have 2 wheels. So if we come across another robot with 2 wheels, we basically look up in this archive, do we already have a controller for any 2-wheeled robot? And if we do, then we basically bootstrap the learning process with the controller from the archive, and then learn from that position rather from the inherited controller. And this actually makes things much, much faster. So and then I'll show you that in a second. So every time we find a controller, we map it to the archive, and much like the kind of QD algorithms, if we want to put something in the archive that there's already controller there, we replace it if the new controller is better than the currently stored one. There's obviously lots of things you can do here. You could store multiple controllers. You can refine the layout of the archive, but this is its kind of most simple form. Okay, so this actually works really well. So this is just 2 environments that we asked the robots to evolve in, and what the blue line is with the archive, and the red line is no archive. And so you can see on the top one, it's you get much faster. So this is the fitness function essentially on the y-axis. You get much faster learning if you do it with this archive, and the number of evaluations, the number of times you have to sample a controller it really reduces by using this archive. So this has really helped us do things faster. Okay, and then so that's kind of evolutionary part, just to show that we can do this in a sort of closed loop where everything is automated. We built this thing that we call the RoboFab. So this has a 3D printer that prints the skeleton, the freeform skeleton of the robot. It has this library of components over here. I'll just run this. And then the entire robot is assembled using this arm. So the arm actually picks the skeleton of the 3D printer. It's attached to the head already in this video. It all looks quite straightforward in the video. A lot of engineering has gone into this to make it work in the design of the clips that stick the things together. So you can see here, it's slotting the wheel onto the clip. It can also do all the wiring up. So, and this is actually the thing that caused the most hassle for the engineers was, so now it pulls out a retracting cable and inserts it into the Raspberry Pi sockets. We did it first with just kind of normal straight cables, and what was happening is they were getting all tangled up around each other, and then one would fall out when the arm was trying to put the other one in, and it was actually a really difficult thing to solve for the engineers. But you can see here that if you can just see the cabling, so basically the entire robot can be assembled by this automated process. Okay, I've just got a few more minutes. Just some other things that make this whole process, either from the engineering or the evolutionary perspective, difficult. Simulators let you do lots of things that you can't do in reality. So they'll sometimes let you have a design that in the simulator, things are kind of like 2 wheels might be kind of touching each other, or like essentially occupying the same part of space. That obviously can't happen in the physical world. There's some constraints on where you can place things. There's also some constraints because of this automated building process. So the arm has to be able to get in, and so this is a simulation of the robot arm trying to attach a component, and it's got to be able to basically find some physical space that it can kind of maneuver through in order to attach the component. So it almost becomes a kind of optimization problem in itself, is deciding the order in which you should attach the components to enable the arm to do it. There's some other things that make it impossible to build robots, like the simulator will let you design a robot with overhanging parts of plastic of the skeleton, and you can't 3D print them because obviously you can't 3D print overhanging things. And none of these things matter in simulation. The simulation will let you get away with all of these things. So we have to do some kind of repair process. We call it a manufacturability test, that before we actually ever build before any robot is evaluated to see how good it is from a fitness perspective, we just check all of these things, and then we just remove robots from the population. Or well, if we try and repair them to try and stop these collisions, or remove them from the population if you can't repair them. And this is really important. Otherwise, you would just end up trying to build all kinds of things that don't actually work. So here's one of the latest things. I think this was just from a couple of weeks ago. So this robot is tasked, well, Evolution is tasked with finding something that can reach this beacon over here. So it's got a sensor that can sense the beacon. It's evolved this kind of weird looking thing with legs and wheels. The wheels are really being used for sort of stabilization, and you can see it uses its front legs to find its way to the beacon. So it is a demonstration, at least, that this evolutionary process can come up with a kind of unique design that is capable of solving the task. So I just want to finish by talking a tiny bit about ethics, because some of you are probably talking about sending robot building factories to planets and faraway places is not necessarily a smart thing to do. We had a lot of attention for this work, and as a recent article in New Scientist, I did a TED Talk recently, which is good that people are paying attention to it. But of course, this also garners the kind of attention that you don't want, with these following newspaper articles talking about our team saying that we were going to wipe out the Earth and things like this. But actually, it does make you think that you have to think seriously about the ethics of this kind of thing. Obviously, you can control this with a human in the loop by just having a big stop button that you can basically stop the whole evolutionary process. In some ways, there's a kind of self-correcting kind of control that you have to build the robots out of something. And so if you have a finite supply of materials, and particularly if you can't recycle, then you can only build what you've got material for. But actually, I mean, I think this kind of idea of building on a planet is a kind of nice motivation for the work, but actually I think there's much more realistic applications of this. So for example, we're all used to the fact that you can do genetic breeding with plants to get things that are resistant to drought or taste better. And there's no reason why you couldn't have some kind of robot breeding system with a human in the loop that kind of basically has a dashboard of seeing what's going on, and it's basically part of the evolution, so they can say, yeah, this is the good direction to go in. We like robots that look like this. We don't like robots that look like that. Exactly the role that the kind of human geneticist has done for many, many years. So just to say another final thing. So the other community that's been a bit interested in this work is actually the biological community. So back in 1992, the famous biologist John Maynard Smith had this quote that actually, if you really want to study evolution, well, we've only got one system to study here on Earth right now. So if we want to generalize about evolving systems, then we might need to look at artificial ones. And actually, there was this nice book about 10 years ago by a biologist that was studying fish, who actually built a population of robots to answer questions about the biological evolution of this kind of particular type of fish he was looking at. It's a very nice book, very short. And so in some ways, you could kind of see this thing that we're trying to build as a kind of research instrument, for looking at evolution, just like we have telescopes and cyclotrons for looking at the planets. Maybe this kind of artificial evolutionary system can help biologists answer some questions about field evolution. So I will leave it there just to say thank you to all of these people, because most of these guys have done most of their practical work here. Okay, I'll stop there.